Hello everyone, I am Ashley Klein with Prevent Connect, and I am thrilled to welcome you to our Prevent Connect campus web conference today, Affirmative Consent Policies, Cultural Barriers, and the Need for Affirmative Sexuality. Prevent Connect is a national program of the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, sponsored by U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views and information provided in this web conference do not necessarily represent the official views of the U.S. government, CDC, or CalCASA. So I really want to start by acknowledging that this is really the beginning of the conversation about consent. We know that rape is happening and discussions around consent are everywhere. Schools and states are adopting affirmative consent policies, and in California, this is even extended to high schools where affirmative consent is now required to be taught to students. And the logical thinking seems to be that the opposite of rape is consent. Therefore, in order to end rape, we must have consent. But our question today, and hopefully the conversations that we'll start today, are really around, is it really that easy? There is absolutely a place for consent education, but it really needs to be part of a larger conversation, which is what we'll hope to at least start today. And so one of the great things is that while we have so much more to learn about prevention, we also know so much more than we did, just 10 years ago. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention recently released a technical package on preventing sexual violence called Stop SV. And the technical package includes strategies based on best available evidence to really help communities hone in on prevention efforts that show the greatest potential to reduce sexual violence. And one of the strategies in the Stop SV technical package that is very relevant to our conversation today is teaching skills to prevent sexual violence. One of the specific ways identified to advance teaching skills to prevent sexual violence is through promoting a healthy sexuality. And I'll circle that here on your screen so you can see that. And so if you haven't already done so, I really encourage everyone to check out the technical package. I'm going to go ahead and put a link in the text box where you can find that. But I think that there's some really good information that will come from today's conversation to inform some of this. So with that, I'd like to turn the floor over to our facilitator today, Dr. Kristen Jaskowski. She is an assistant professor of public health, an affiliate faculty in gender studies, and the director of the Sexual Health Research Lab at the University of Arkansas. She is also a research fellow at the Kinsey Institute for Research in Sex, Gender, and Reproduction at Indiana University. We're very excited to have you here with us today, Kristen. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you for that introduction.
No problem. So you have the floor, so you can take it away.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Ashley, and thank you again for that great lead-in to the discussion that I'd like to have around consent and in particular affirmative consent policies. Before I start, I would like to thank everyone for attending this webinar. We were speaking earlier a couple of minutes ago about how nice the weather is across the country, where various people are situated. So I really appreciate people taking the time to out of the nice weather to come and listen to this presentation. I hope it'll be worth your while. And as Ashley said, this presentation is really focused on affirmative consent policies, and I think I will present hopefully evidence to suggest that the need for affirmative sexuality to really accurately enforce affirmative consent policies. So I wanted to begin the discussion here today with just a couple of learning objectives so you have a sense of what to expect in the webinar. And the three sort of learning objectives that I think apply to this webinar, really, I'll first begin the presentation discussing some of the commonly used cues that college students report to communicate and interpret sexual consent from, with sexual partners, and discuss how these cues fit into the miscommunication theory. And if you're not familiar with what that means, I will certainly be explaining that as well. And then I would also want to segue into some discussion around sociocultural factors that might serve as barriers to affirmative consent policies and consent promotion-based programming more generally. And then finally, I hope to conclude the talk by identifying some different opportunities that we can integrate sexual consent education as part of really a comprehensive approach to addressing sexual violence on college campuses. And I know that many of you work in various facets of sexual violence prevention or sexual violence education or research. So I'm hoping to have a great discussion over this web conference around some of these issues, particularly the last point about, what we can do. So to begin this talk, as I just mentioned, many of you are already working in many different facets of sexual assault prevention, and so you're probably already familiar with the fact that sexual violence is a salient public health issue facing, college students, in particular college women. And recently there's been a series of events which has sort of reignited sexual assault as this, major public health issue, potentially beginning with the 2011 Dear Colleague letter, which identified sexual violence as part of a Title IX and sexual discrimination issue. But that wasn't the only event, and we've seen the implementation of the White House Task Force to protect students from sexual assault, the release of the Not Alone report, the launching of national campaigns to address sexual assault. So these were all really great initiatives. And in the last couple of years, we've seen implementation of affirmative consent policies, particularly in California and New York. And so that's where I really want to focus discussion today, is on some affirmative consent policies. So if you're not familiar, what affirmative consent means or what these policies mean, basically in 2014, the California legislature has passed legislation saying that public universities of higher education that receive state funds needed to adopt an affirmative consent policy. And I'm going to read from the legislation what that means. So they say affirmative consent means affirmative, conscious, and voluntary agreement to engage in sexual activity. It is the responsibility of each person involved in the sexual activity to ensure that he or she has the affirmative consent of the other or others to engage in the sexual activity. Lack of protest or resistance does not mean consent, nor does silence mean consent. Affirmative consent must be ongoing throughout a sexual activity and can be revoked at any time. The existence of a dating relationship between the persons involved or the fact of a past relation between them should never by itself be assumed to be an indicator of consent. So as you can see from this legislation, there's a lot that goes into this affirmative consent, policy implementation. The important points I've tried to draw out as bullet points on this slide, which is that affirmative consent really requires students to utilize consent to sex that is voluntary, that's communicated, it's voluntary, and that not saying no or not saying anything shouldn't qualify as consent. And so, like I said, in 2014, California was the first state to adopt this legislation that says, or to implement this legislation, which says that universities need to adopt this policy. In 2015, New York followed suit, and now we're seeing different states, discuss and consider adopting affirmative consent policies, and we're seeing a lot of discussion about affirmative consent policies at institutions of higher education throughout the country. Now, there hasn't, affirmative consent policies, of course, have critiques, as does all, public health interventions or policy-related interventions. Some common critiques around or criticisms of affirmative consent policy is, a major one that I think we often see in public health, which is that the government doesn't have the right to control behavior. So in this case, I think we hear sort of statements like the government shouldn't control what goes on in my bedroom, and they can't legislate, what I do behind closed doors and so forth. And like I said, I think that we've seen similar critiques of other public health policies. One that comes to mind is sort of critiques around the New York policy around soda, which ultimately got revoked, but the idea that the government can't control how much I have to drink. Or we've seen this even with motorcycle helmets in various states, that the government shouldn't tell me what to do. So we kind of have that rhetoric, and it's certainly been applied to these affirmative consent policies. We've also heard critiques that include things like, well, affirmative consent is going to ruin the moment. It's going to ruin the spontaneity of the sex, and it's not going to make it as good. At the end of this talk, I'll actually discuss some research I've done that kind of refutes that. But nonetheless, I think we have this assumption that if we talk about sex before we have it, it's not as spontaneous, it's not as sexy, it's not as fun. And so that's been applied to affirmative consent, a critique of affirmative consent. And then finally, another critique, which actually I've written about, is that affirmative consent does not align with the current norms about how college students communicate consent. And this, I think, is a really interesting critique, because I've argued that if it did align with the norms, there would need to be a policy, right? So if college students were already engaging in affirmative consent regularly, and that was the normative practice, well, then we wouldn't need a policy to address that behavior change. So, so I think, that's kind of an interesting critique. In order to really think about affirmative consent, I think it's important, in order to think about implementing affirmative consent and whether or not it'll be effective, I think it's important to understand where affirmative consent comes from. And I mentioned the term miscommunication theory as during one of the learning objectives. Essentially, miscommunication theory is this idea that essentially men don't really understand that they need to obtain consent, or that they don't really understand what obtaining consent looks like. And as a result, there's a miscommunication between men and women, and that miscommunication leads to men inadvertently forcing sex on a woman or having non-consensual sex with a woman because they didn't understand that she was refusing. Now, there is some research that supports the miscommunication theory. For example, there's some laboratory-based research that suggests that men overinterpret women's cues of sexual interest. So these studies are really interesting. They've positioned individuals to engage in a gender dynamic in which men are talking to women, and in these scenarios, men interpreted what women were saying as implying sexual interest, whereas the women were thinking that they were being friendly, basically. And then in other studies, which we had observers and so forth, again, men were interpreting women's cues as being more sexual, and women were interpreting those same cues as indicating friendliness. So there's this overarching assumption that men are thinking that women are being more sexual, and women are thinking that they're really just communicating friendliness. So there's what the researchers have argued is that there's this potential for miscommunication. Miscommunication theories can also be supported by research around token resistance. And if you're not familiar with what that term means, essentially token resistance refers to situations in which women, particularly women, might say no but really mean yes. So the idea is that no, that refusal is really token, so it's not legitimate. It's not a legitimate refusal. And so there's research to suggest that men believe that when women are refusing, that refusing is not really true. It's not really what women believe, and ultimately they will consent to sex. So the rationale with affirmative consent policies is that if we obtain explicit consent more frequently, we'll have a reduction in these miscommunications, and that'll reduce non-consensual sex. And this doesn't just go for affirmative consent policies, but any prevention mechanism in which promoting consent is the purpose or the crux of the program. So affirmative consent policies would be one such example. But basically, the miscommunication theory is at the heart of any consent promotion-based programming. Now, there also is plenty of research that contests the miscommunication theory. And researchers say, it's not about a miscommunication, and there's a body of research that refutes this theory. For example, there's several studies that I have listed there that suggest that women indeed do communicate consent clearly, and men can accurately interpret women's consent refusals. And that even includes women's refusals that might be nonverbal and even implicit refusals. There's also research, again, about that term token resistance. In fact, research suggesting that women rarely engage in token resistance, that's not, that is not a common occurrence, and that when women say no, they often mean no. And then finally, there's some really interesting conversational analysis research. Now, this research focuses on looking at refusals generally, how people refuse in conversation generally, and then applying it to refusals of sex. And so, what these researchers argue is that the way we refuse sex is very similar to the way we refuse anything. And the way people normally go about refusing follows a particular pattern in which, we first offer, when we're refusing something, we first offer a remark that's sort of palliative to soften the blow of refusing. And then, rather than outright refuse, we instead provide an explanation of why we can't do something rather than outright saying no. So what that might look like, for example, is if someone were to say, hey, Kristen, do you want to go to the movie with me this afternoon? I might say to them, gee, I really wish I could, offering that palliative remark, but then say, instead, though, I have to do this webinar with Prevent Connect. So in that refusal, I never said the word no. Instead, I didn't say I didn't want to go to the movies with them, or I had no interest, or I didn't outright say no to them. Instead, I offered this explanation that I have to do this webinar, therefore I can't go to the movies. And research suggests that people would interpret that as a refusal. They know that I'm declining that invitation. If someone said to me, hey, Kristen, do you want to go to the movies with me this afternoon? It would be odd if I just said no outright and didn't provide any type of explanation for that. So the researchers then applied this to sexual scenarios and sexual situations and found, again, that young adults have this refined ability to understand a refusal, even those refusals, like I said, that are nonverbal and implicit, but also refusals that don't include the word no. So these researchers really kind of suggest that it's not about, that sexual violence is not predicated or not about a miscommunication. So at this point, I was interested in engaging and getting some feedback from folks in the audience, and in particular, what you guys thought in terms of factors that might influence consent. If you knew anything about the miscommunication theory or any of this research, or just any other factors that you have in your own work that you think might influence consent.
Great. Thank you, Kristen. I mean, this is really fascinating and important for us working in the field to understand. And so while we wait to hear from folks in our audience, there were a couple questions that came up. And so Lauren was wondering, research on how token resistance is research on how token resistance is related to how the media portrays consent.
Yeah, I saw. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, you please weigh in on that.
Yeah, I was looking at that, and then also seeing the next comment about this idea that women play hard to get, that sort of mentality that gets portrayed. Well, unfortunately, I don't know much. I can't say much in terms of what's been published in regard to research specifically on media examples of token resistance. But what I can tell you is to be a little bit patient, because I actually just finished a really great time-consuming study with my doctoral students in which we looked at popular movies, popular for a college audience, movies that we sort of cross-listed, common popular movies with highest grossing movies, and looked at portrayals of how consent was being depicted in these mainstream movies. So we're in the process of analyzing those data, but what I can say is that unfortunately the depictions in media are not great examples and are not great models, and they do tend to perpetuate some of these myths around consent, one of which being, token resistance.
Great. Well, it looks like there's some great ideas about what other factors influence consent. So past sexual encounters, intention when asking for consent, what we're taught at home, and sex ed, which I think is where we're headed in this conversation. Expectation that people expect you to have sex with them, Jamie says. Also things about like power differentials, how mutual respect, examples of education on healthy relationships. So there are many other factors that influence consent. Dan says porn and entitlement. Fear of ridicule if you say no, Karen says. So thank you all so much for these great, factors that are no doubt influencing.
Absolutely, and some of the explanations that people are giving are very much echoed in the research, talking about past relationships. There's research talking about the term precedence theory, the idea that if you've had consensual sex before in the past, whether or not you're in a romantic relationship, the expectation is that in any future encounters, you'll consent to sex. So there's definitely a lot of research to support what folks are saying. Should I continue on, or do we want to get some more answers?
Sure. Why don't you go ahead and continue on?
Okay. Well, a lot of what people were already saying, in fact, is things that I plan to talk about. And I'm really glad people mentioned things like sex education and power differentials and entitlement and our expectations when it comes to sex. Because these are, sort of issues that get embedded in our culture that ultimately influence consent, whether or not we consciously are aware of that. So for the next part of the presentation, I want to talk about at least 4 of these, and I chose these 4 sociocultural factors that influence consent, and it sounds like that is what folks are thinking as well, so I'm glad we're all on the same page. But I want to unpack these a little bit more, presenting some research that speaks to these different factors and how they might influence consent. So first I want to talk about sexuality education in the United States. And in this discussion, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about abstinence-only sex education. When it comes to sex education, I would argue as a sex researcher, it's somewhat unquestionable that adolescent sexuality in the United States is entrenched in controversy. We see a lot of that depicted in our approaches and our feelings about, birth control and exposing kids even to research. The YRBS data I was reading last night, looking up youth and YRBS, and I was reading an article that was saying, can you believe what kids are being asked in school? And it was the items from the YRBS about using condoms and so forth. So there's a lot of negative feelings we have about adolescent sexuality, and I think as a culture in the United States, we're made uncomfortable by the idea that adolescents do have sexuality and they are interested in sex. And in that vein, teens are seeking out information about sex. Teens get information from a number of different sources that include parents, peers, and the media, as people have already mentioned. But another source that teens get information from is sexuality in school, which sexuality education programs in school, and the type of programming that students are exposed to is also sort of rife with controversy. As a country, in the United States, as a country, we don't have any requirements on providing sexuality or, for that matter, HIV education in schools. So that results in states mandating education on an individual basis. There's 2 sort of main, camps of sexuality education. There's abstinence-only, or sometimes we hear abstinence-only until marriage, sex education. And then we hear comprehensive sexuality education. So in brief, if you're not familiar with this language or don't know what these mean, I would highly suggest looking into it. Advocates for Youth is a great resource, or SECUS, which stands for the Sexuality Information Education Council of the United States, are all really great resources for sexuality education. But briefly, abstinence-only education is sort of what it sounds like, an emphasis on abstinence as the expected standard, and as the 100% mechanism to prevent unintended pregnancies and sexually transmitted infections. Now, depending on the program and the geographic location, other topics might be included, but sometimes and generally we see discussions of things like birth control or condoms in abstinence-based education talked about only in terms of their failure rates rather than their effectiveness rates. And if you're interested in comparisons between abstinence-only and comprehensive sex education, a researcher named Kirby, Kirby, has done a lot of really good research sort of comparing and demonstrating evidence-based programming. So the other type of sex education that I mentioned was comprehensive sex ed, which does include a component of abstinence, but also includes other topics that include birth control or condoms, maybe discussions in a best-case scenario, discussions about healthy relationships and gender in the media and so forth. But we also know that some of this is limited on how much time teachers have to talk about some of these issues. Now, presenting students with just abstinence doesn't really provide a lot of preparation. As we know, according to the CDC, average age of first sex is about 17, and that people have between four partners for women and about 6.5 partners on average for men. So a focus on abstinence only is somewhat unrealistic. So in that vein, I wanted to pause for a moment and ask what messages about consent you might have been exposed to, whether formally or formally in sex ed or informally growing up.
Great. Thank you, Kristen. I mean, one thing that I've been thinking about is the lack of information or even misinformation that young people have, and this idea that for those who go on to college is now a place where suddenly we undo all of this. When learning about consent really starts so much earlier than college, even if it's not being explicitly taught. So we'd love to hear from our audience, and it looks like folks are weighing in. So Paige says this idea that love, in quotation marks, equals consent. Yes means yes and no means no was taught. Consent is a woman's responsibility. Stevie says women weren't supposed to want sex. Nothing really, no means no in college. So I think, Angela, that's kind of to my point that we don't have these conversations, and then suddenly in college we're now starting to talk about this. Melissa says, I think a lot of parents want to believe their children won't even be in that type of situation in the first place. So maybe there's no messages, or not so much no messages, but no explicit conversation around the idea of consent. So Kristen, I don't know if you see, but a lot of people are weighing in. Yeah, Jeanette says sex is intuitive and you don't need to talk about it ever. It's just something that happens.
Yep, that is definitely, I think, consistent with what I'm going to present upcoming, in that, there's a lot of misinformation and potentially no information that youth are receiving. I do like that comment that I think, Ashley, you said, but maybe echoed by some of the respondents, in that now, we get these students in college now are expected to do all of these messages, undo all of these messages around consent, and I think it's important for us, as college educators or folks working with college students, to understand what some of those messages might be. Now, if we're looking at, again, abstinence-only education, as we were just talking about, many students might enter college with limited knowledge about sex, as some of the respondents said, look, I didn't have any kind of, information. Instead of comprehensive sex ed, as we just talked about, a lot of times high school students in the United States are exposed to exclusively abstinence-only programming, or maybe no information at all, and their parents didn't really talk about it with them. In fact, only about 22 states plus Washington, D.C. even mandate sex ed. 13 states in the United States state that sexuality education needs to be medically accurate. 8 states have legislation saying that sex education needs to be culturally appropriate and unbiased, and only 2 states say that sexuality education cannot promote religion. So you can see that a lot of these different states have different rules and restrictions about sexuality. So when students are getting sex ed, if it's abstinence only, the main focus is going to be primarily on don't do it, right? And to some extent, this can actually translate into some good information about refusing sex. But as I'll show you in the next couple of slides, some of those messages generally put the onus on one individual, and that's usually women, to do, the refusing. And that many of these abstinence-based programs actually treat gender stereotypes as factual, and then end up disseminating inaccurate information about, other issues, not just consent, but things like contraception and condoms. And when the focus on education is primarily on don't do it, these programs don't really provide a space for students to consider their own criteria for engaging in sex. Abstinence-only education doesn't really address topics such as like how to give consent, how to ask for sex, or how to infer consent from somebody else. Again, the only thing that they're presenting with is don't do it. And this, unfortunately, leaves students unprepared when they enter college and are faced, or even in high school when they're faced with sexual situations. And then complicating this further, young women and men enter with these different cultural messages, so not just what they're receiving in schools, but from the wider culture. In schools and in the wider culture, girls typically get the message of risk and disease and immorality associated with sexuality, and this ends up getting associated with traditional views and ideologies of women as being somewhat sexually passive. And you'll see, I think, some of that exemplified in some of these examples. Over the next couple slides, I have some examples and excerpts from some abstinence-only education programs. So some abstinence-only education programs imply, or some of them even directly state, that rape can be avoided. These programs state that if a woman does experience sexual assault, it might be her fault. And so you can see on the slide here, for example, in a program called Sex Respect, the responsibility for avoiding rape is placed on girls through their demeanor and attire choice. They say, as I have up here, you can say no by the way you act, talk, and dress. Wear clothes that advertise you, not your sexiness. So again, this message that what you wear, it makes some kind of statement about what you would do in terms of consenting to sex. Similar message sort of echoed in Families, Decision-Making, and Human Development, another program, which suggests that women should, quote, choose to dress in a way that does not suggest to others that you're looking for sexual activity. So, this rhetoric sends a message to girls, but also to boys, that consent can be interpreted through clothing, and therefore, as a result, women, it's not a long stretch to say that women are then to blame for enticing men if they force sex on her because of how she was dressed, and we see that as a common, rape myth. We also see abstinence-only education, abstinence-only curricula portraying girls as non-sexual and boys as sexually aggressive and manipulative. One program, I don't have it up on the slide, but one program called RSVP perpetuates some damaging stereotypes in an activity they did about dating relationships. And so they talked about, in this activity, they had boys and girls talk about a scenario in which a girl might allow a boy to study with her alone in her bedroom. And they ask, the girls a series of questions about this and what they think of this scenario. And a lot of this questioning perpetuates stereotypes that the boys are only looking for sex, and therefore, girls shouldn't even let a boy study or work or be with her alone because he might inadvertently force sex on her in this scenario or in this situation. And this activity really, it kind of made me sad in the sense that it really implies that boys are just out to be manipulative if they're given the opportunity by their girlfriend or their friend letting them study with them alone in the room. And not only is it shaping our ways of viewing men and women, but it's also creating poor depictions of adolescent sexuality and poor gender dynamics. Now, what I have on the slide here, two other examples from two other programs, Sex, Respect, and Facts, and these two excerpts imply that men are being deceptive in their tactics to acquire sex, from women. As I have up in the slide, according to Sex, Respect, boys tend to use love to get sex, girls tend to use sex to get love, and you can see this sentiment echoed in Facts, which caution that, quote, men may use love to get sex. For example, tell a girl you love her so she'll do things sexually, whereas women, they use sex to get love. They might do something sexually to hold on to a boy. And so you can see in these examples, and also from the example I was talking about earlier from RSVP, these programs imply that, again, men are deceptive in their tactics to acquire sex, and frankly that women are uninterested in sex, and the only reason they'd even have sex is because they want to be loved by a boy or have that relationship. And so this conceptualization of adolescent sexuality, first of all, ignores adolescent girls' potential for sexual desire, which, if you're interested in more information on that, there's some great work by a woman named Michelle Fine, and she does a lot on the missing discourse of desire in sexuality education, particularly pertaining to young women or to girls. But it also, I think, perpetuates a really bad image of boys as potentially uncaring, unfeeling, deceitful, and even manipulative, which, I think if I were a mother of a son or, taking a sex education class that was telling my son that, hey, you're going to be manipulative, I would be pretty unhappy with that message as well. And so, in general, if young women can't see themselves as legitimate sexual subjects, as Michelle Fine argues, how will they even be able to articulate consent or refuse unwanted sex in a sexual situation? And how are they even expected to know what they want in terms of sex if they're not presented with sort of an array of information and an ability to see themselves as as sexual, which I think is part of the heart of abstinence-only education. They want to avoid adolescents seeing themselves as potentially sexual beings. We also have, which I alluded to already, but we also can see problematic messages with abstinence-only education through the reinforcing of stereotypical conceptualizations of gender and sexuality. And what I mean by this is that through abstinence-only messages, boys and men get portrayed as sexual initiators. They're the ones who are responsible for starting sexual interactions. And women are sexual gatekeepers. They're the ones who are responsible for saying no or yes. So, in this vein, abstinence-only education sort of emphasizes the expectation that adolescents, and in particular adolescent girls, can refuse sex, but as I already mentioned, it suggests that men are, somewhat unable to stop themselves. So, it's important important and I'd even say healthy to teach young women and also men that they have the right to say no. I think that's a really important message, that they can say no to unwanted sex or sex that they don't desire. But as Cantor et al. States, and I quote, "Reinforcing girls' ability and right to say no is not enough if boys are not taught to hear and understand the word no." A failure to direct some of these messages at boys kind of exempts them from the conversation, which was really interesting to me. One of the comments made that that this is a woman's issue, that therefore boys are not responsible for any of this. And I think we see some of these themes reinforced through our abstinence-based education. And then again, this idea that men are uncontrollable also means they're not held responsible. Now, if you think back to that previous slide I just had up, if men can't help themselves, particularly if women are wearing these scantily clad clothing or revealing clothing, it's no wonder that they might force sex on a woman. That's what the messages are that are from these programs that are being sent, and that all gets translated into depictions of sexuality that tell women that they're at fault if rape occurs, or in fact that the expectation should be that men will rape, and we'll see that come up at the end of the presentation in terms of some discourse around college campuses. Now, I think that in general this is a pretty depressing state, but it also implies that consent is somewhat irrelevant, because if they're uncontrollable and they're going to do whatever they want anyway, what's the point of consent? That's what I think the message that's being communicated through these programs. And also, furthermore, abstinence-only education is reinforcing these stereotypical roles that the women need to fend off the guy's advances, so they're forced into that role of sexual gatekeeper, and that men are then forced into this role of sexual initiator. So it's not really surprising when college students' consent communication aligns with this traditional sexual script of men as initiators, women as gatekeepers. In fact, a researcher, Dr. Zoe Peterson, who's at the University of Missouri in St. Louis, her and I have done several studies together, and one we actually found that the ways in which college students indicated consent really very closely aligned with these traditional sexual scripts in which women need to wait to be asked, and then they can say yes, and men are the ones who are expected to be asking for sex. So we can see that this is getting potentially learned in high school, but then certainly following through in college. And as a result, it'll be really difficult for young people to sort of conceptualize any type of alternatives from these sexually scripted roles, and that has some ramifications, which I'm going to talk about in a couple more slides. So to switch gears a little bit, we talked about how without mandates on sex ed, the information that's enter college with is somewhat varied. So many students might be entering college, which is already unfamiliar with limited information, and they're entering this environment that, like I said, is unfamiliar, and now is including other components like partying and alcohol, which is the next sociocultural issue that I'm going to discuss, the college party scene. And I'm going to talk about how elements of the college party scene influence our perceptions and interpretations of sexual consent, and how that relates to affirmative consent policies. So in that regard, I think first it's important to start off by saying that, as many of us who work on college campuses know, college has sort of been conceptualized as this time to experiment. Social scripts sort of indicate that young adults should experiment, and that includes partying, drinking alcohol, and sexuality. I think of even movies that are old as, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the name, Animal House from the 70s. You can think about the sort of alcohol-fueled sex scenes that occurred in that movie, but even, old school in the early 2000s, and then 21 and Over, which came out in, I think, 2013. These movies all share similar themes in that part of college is drinking and having sex. Now, I would argue that there's really nothing inherently problematic about experimenting from a developmental perspective, but it can become problematic if one gender is sort of largely in control of this party dynamic. that's what I'm going to talk about a bit, and I have some work up there, some citations up there by Hamilton and Armstrong and Hamilton, and that 2013 citation is a book that they wrote called Paying for the Party, How College Perpetuates Inequality. Now that book is really focusing on socioeconomic status and how college, is influenced by and influences socioeconomic status, but they spend a lot of time also talking about party culture and sexuality, and so it's something that I would highly recommend. According to their work, according to Armstrong and her work, socializing among college students often involves partying, alcohol, and the expectation to drink heavily. So as we just talked about the messages that students are getting from abstinence-only education, if they're entering college with very little information, but then also very little experience with alcohol and how it will affect them, there's opportunity, I think, for issues and problems to occur. New students are typically too young to buy alcohol legally, and a lot of residence halls have policies that forbid alcohol on campus, particularly if you're underage. And I don't have anything wrong with those policies. I think that that's important to have, particularly because we have an age of legal age of drinking. But what I think it's important to acknowledge is that these policies sometimes push students off campus or into other spaces that they're unfamiliar with, like fraternity parties that might be gendered spaces that could result in some problematic outcomes, because these students end up consuming alcohol that's provided by others in locations that they're not familiar with, in this largely sexualized environment with this expectation of party culture includes sexuality. And I want to quote here for a minute. It's a long quote, so bear with me, but it's a quote from Elizabeth Armstrong's work from a 2006 article that she wrote about the party rape culture. And she says, in respect to fraternities and party culture, she says, fraternities control every aspect of parties at their houses: themes, music, transportation, admission, access to alcohol, and movements of guests. Party themes usually require women to wear scant, sexy clothing and place women in subordinate positions to men, such as pimps and hoes, Victoria's Secrets, and Playboy Mansion. So those were some of the themes that she found common to fraternity parties. She goes on to say that women seek control over turf, transportation, and liquor as part of the expected party dynamics, and then are expected to be grateful for men's hospitality in providing these things. And then women, are expected to be quote unquote nice to the men who host the parties, and part of being nice might actually be tolerating some unwanted sexual contact, even when it makes women feel uncomfortable because women feel on some level that they owe men for hosting the party. And I'm going to provide you with some evidence upcoming from some of my interviews that sort of speak to this. Now, I don't mean to suggest in any way that men are looking for opportunities to rape. Armstrong actually points out that women's vulnerability in these situations is only problematic if men choose to exploit it, right? If women are giving up turf and transportation and so forth, that's not necessarily problematic unless men choose to exploit that. And unfortunately, as we've seen in research, some men do exploit these vulnerabilities, and as they're sort of competing for to have sex with as many women as possible, that's sort of a gender dynamic expectation for men. So I think that we can see that there's problems arising within the way in which we situate our expectations for college students and partying. Now, this picture that I have here, this is coming from an article that I have under review with my colleague, Dr. Jackie Wiersma-Mosley, here at the University of Arkansas. And so I just want to be clear, this article is still under review, but I thought it was important to show that this was our sort of conceptualization based on a large summary of research that we did. We found that there are a host of factors that somewhat synergistically create what Dr. Wiersma-Mosley and I called, quote, a recipe for rape. This figure comes from a large literature search that we did, in the way that we sort of, and others, other researchers have talked about these issues relating together. And I won't spend time going over every detail, but I do want to point out, let me see if I can, I don't know if I can use that marker here, but point out a couple of things. These elements here in the green are really depicting this underlying male dominance as part of the party culture, and this underlies the entire, what I would say, the entire model here. We also can see, and I have this depicted here and down here, that there's aspects of privilege through the male-dominated party culture, and this privilege and power perpetuates. And you can see, because we put it as both contributing to male dominance and sexual assault, but also related to the outcomes of sexual assault and perpetuating these outcomes. So it's sort of, this privilege is sort of working at both ends of this system, and as many researchers, Armstrong, as one example, talks about that the expectation in college is to party. Whether or not you like to party or do party, the expectation is that there's emphasis on partying, and therefore, as we see here, if we acknowledge that rape is a potential outcome of some of the synergistic, dynamics from the party culture, and the outcome could be rape, the idea of acknowledging that and criticizing it might actually be damaging to students, and therefore they'd rather, and that could result in students feeling ostracized. And that might seem odd to us as educators, that a student would rather experience sexual assault and then not report it, or a friend might blame the victim, even though the victim is her friend, for causing the sexual assault. And that might seem odd to us, but I think that it's important to remember the stakes are really high for college students, particularly to fit in. And so feeling ostracized is really important. So all that's to say is that I think that potentially this figure is even just demonstrating that all of these issues are quite complex. Now, if you're interested in more details on that, I'd be happy to send you that article if it gets published and once it comes out, because I do think it's rather interesting. But of course, I'm biased. And I just wanted to echo some of these findings I mentioned on about 2 slides ago, that when I was saying that there's this idea that women are expected to be nice to men who host the parties. I wanted to provide some explicit evidence for that from some of my research. Now, I'm going to present a couple of different examples throughout the presentation, or the next couple slides. And just to give you a little context, these were interviews that I conducted with college students. All of the names are pseudonyms. The ages are accurately reflected. And in these interviews, I was basically conducting interviews about how college students conceptualize and communicate consent. And my doctoral student and I analyzed some of these data, and we found a number of different themes which speak to different factors that influence consent. One of which being this idea that good girls can't refuse. So like I was saying on the previous slide, women are expected to be nice. I think you can see from some of these quotes from some of my participants that was really ingrained in women, as you can see from Jessica here, that the expectation is that guys will buy you a drink, and then they have that expectation that you owe them something, and if you don't reciprocate, you somewhat feel bad. I mean, Erica says that it's a huge blow to their ego if you reject them, and Jennifer says that she feels, pressured, especially if she's at the fraternity house, if she sleeps there, to reciprocate through sex. So we can see this theme being echoed by some of the participants in my work. I wanted to take a second and pause here. I've spent a lot of time talking about some of these aspects of college culture, and demonstrating that, or depicting that figure. So I wanted to pause for a second and ask the folks here what what the culture is like on the campuses that they work with, and if any of this is indicative, or maybe their campus is a little bit different than this.
Great. Thank you so much, Kristen. And I wanted to say that there's a lot of sharing of resources that's going on in the text chat. And so Amy mentioned from Men as Peacemakers, the safe party model, to address the need for safe party environments for college students. And so there are some other resources being shared in that text chat, looking at how can we change the norms of a party culture. And I've always felt like you can tell a lot about the climate or culture on a campus through things like party themes and et cetera. So It looks like folks are saying that Chelsea says there's substantial blame the victim mentality, especially if there's alcohol involved, and peers are really quick to blame the victim. The campuses that Penny's working with mention the impact on the abuser as opposed to the victim. And that's a really significant conversation that is going on. Let's see. Alyssa is saying that it's the best party model, the resource I was talking about. So I'll put a link to that. But so, I mean, culture on campus, Kristen, from the things that are coming across, it sounds like a lot of cultures on college campuses really look like this, that there's victim blaming, that even there's a denial of this being a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And I saw some people talking about entitlement and power, and I think that when you're talking about a party scene that's controlled by one gender, you're also talking about power there, and folks are talking about athletics in terms of power and other dynamics. And certainly it sounds like there are some myths like rape doesn't happen on my campus. I had a colleague who said that her campus did a study of sexual assault and found that there were 0 sexual assaults. And because they'd asked the college students, have you ever been raped? And she said they came up with 0. And I said, well, that's not surprising. We didn't ask it the right way, or you didn't ask it the right way. So I think that there's a lot of these myths that that folks are talking about that are sounds like shared across a lot of different campuses. One that is shared, and I've already mentioned, is the role that alcohol plays. It plays a significant role in college life. But unfortunately, it's somewhat difficult to study alcohol and consent, which there's actually little research that looks at these two constructs together, which seems somewhat surprising. But when you actually think about it, the lack of research, when you actually think about it, it's somewhat difficult to study these issues. On the one hand, you've got sexual assault and consent are very much related, and then sexual assault and alcohol are very much related. So there's definitely this obvious need to study it, but then when you actually start to think about it, studying alcohol consumption and consent might be ethically challenging because, first of all, alcohol consumption, as we know, clouds someone's ability to actually get consent, and then engaging in sex with someone who's too intoxicated to consent is a definition of sexual assault. So, this sort of begs the question: how intoxicated is too intoxicated to communicate and interpret consent? And unfortunately, there's not a clean, easy answer for that. And we know that college students are having sex in conjunction with alcohol, so it's a really important issue to discuss, as it can lead to what some people have already been talking about in terms of victim blaming and affecting the ways which we sort of approach sexual assault. There's a lot of different research that suggests that alcohol in combination with sexuality can be somewhat problematic. There's evidence to suggest that alcohol alters the dynamic of sexual consent in a couple different ways. First, individuals who consume alcohol might be perceived as being more sexually interested and available than those who are not consuming alcohol. And a lot of this research is laboratory-based research that looks at people's expectations around someone who's been consuming alcohol, and the perceptions are sometimes related to people's alcohol expectancies, which is the belief in alcohol's disinhibitory and sort of aphrodisiac powers. And if you're interested in that work, Jeanette Norris out of Washington State does a lot of really interesting work about alcohol expectancies and how that might influence and impact consent. Also, intoxication can inhibit women's attention to cues and consequences in terms of risk factors. So there's that aspect as well. And then, alcohol can also complicate consent because intoxicated women might be less, or intoxicated individuals, I shouldn't just say women, might be less likely to perceive, cues and also women who are consuming alcohol, and women and men who are consuming alcohol might have a difficult time perceiving each other's cues or communicating cues. But then women who consume alcohol are sometimes perceived as being more sexually permissive and available. And I've got some data here, some interview data that I wanted to present to sort of support some of these other findings. Again, in our interview study, we found that that women and men were talking about situations in which there's this relationship between alcohol and consent. And you can see here with what Stacy's saying, she's saying that if you take drinks all night from a guy, you're telling him that you'll have sex with him. So she's again talking here about how the communication of potentially consent could be occurring based on whether or not you'll accept a drink from someone. And what Russ talks about is a little bit different, and he's being somewhat coercive, or he could potentially be talking about some coercion here. He says, if a woman is drinking, she's more likely to let it happen. So he'll sometimes buy a girl that he likes a drink to help things along. So again, this relationship between consent and alcohol exists, according to Russ. In this particular excerpt, he could be, just talking about using alcohol as a social lubricant, but he could also be talking about some coercive tactics, which might be, which would be problematic. And then here, Sandra's is a long quote from Sandra, but she's talking about some gender dynamics with regard to sex that ends up influencing behavior in relation to consent and alcohol. So in this exchange, she said to me, she has a friend who gets drunk so she can have sex. She has an excuse to have sex. Sandra says that, some of her friends say, oh, I had sex with so-and-so because I was too drunk, and she uses alcohol as an excuse. And so, I think this last part is interesting, that sometimes her friend says that sometimes she's not always drunk, but she and a whole lot of other people use that as an excuse to why they hooked up with someone. It's like, oh, I was drunk, and that happened because I was drunk. So I asked, was this an excuse? And she says, yeah, for the women, and they need to have this reason or else they're just considered kind of trampy. And so we can kind of see this gender dynamic existing in which we're perpetuating these stereotypes about women. Therefore, they need to not be authentic to their true selves by instead saying, well, I had sex under the influence of alcohol. That isn't really me. That's just this other persona. Because, as we think about earlier from that abstinence-based education, we don't allow people, but in particular women, a space to consider their own sexuality. So moving on here a little bit, alcohol use and consent is very complicated, as we were sort of unpacking. And another somewhat equally complicated issue is this idea of sexual ambivalence. And I think sometimes people misunderstand or misuse the word ambivalence. Ambivalence doesn't mean indifferent, but rather it means feeling conflicted over something. And complicating consent further is that, sex is maybe not always wanted or unwanted. People might feel torn. They might feel ambivalent and have favorable and unfavorable attitudes or feelings or thoughts about engaging in sex. And people might feel ambivalent in a couple different ways. They might feel ambivalent about sex in general, about sex with a particular partner, or sex in particular circumstances. They could also have, positive or negative feelings about the sexual encounter itself. They might feel, both aroused, but then maybe self-conscious. Or they might feel ambivalent about the possible outcomes of sex, like the effects it might have on relationships. And some of our feelings about ambivalence, like we saw with alcohol, might be gender-specific. Young women might find sex arousing, but then worry that they might be called sluts, as we saw from from Stacy in the previous slide. And alternatively, women who find sex unappealing might want to do it for relationship maintenance. And there's some interesting research from folks. Burkett and Hamilton in 2012 wrote a really interesting article about how women engage in uncomfortable or unwanted sex as a mechanism or a belief that was just part of relationship maintenance. So, ambivalence can have a number of different outcomes related to consent. And because people feel ambivalent, they might be motivated to avoid thinking about sexual activity altogether, or might be reluctant to even acknowledge that they might want to engage in sex. And there's some really interesting research that demonstrates that people who, this is a perspective study, that students who were asked about their intentions to have sex and to use a condom before sex might have happened, and then a week later they were re-asked about their actual behavior. And students who reported more ambivalence early on also reported were less accurate in their predictions about whether or not they had sex. And they were also less likely to use a condom. So we can see this very clear link between ambivalence and some of our behaviors. And then finally, I think a similar phenomenon occurs with ambivalence in communicating consent. Someone's positive feelings about sex might lead to a willingness to have sex, but then they might have these negative feelings that might make them reluctant to explicitly communicate consent. So they might not want to take responsibility for being sexual or admit to sex because they don't want to have this, like, quote, premeditated sex that might make them, slutty, but they might prefer to think about the encounter as unplanned or something that just happened. And indeed, this language of just happened is a very common way that college students report, consent, that sex just happened and there was really not consent involved. And so, I'd like to take a second here and pause again and ask the folks on the webinar what they might have heard from college students that contribute to feeling ambivalent towards sex.
Thank you, Kristen. I think this is also important to take into consideration when we're thinking about our prevention efforts. There's just so much about sex that we're not comfortable with as a society discussing, and at the same time, it's really necessary to have these conversations because we really want to promote more of what we do want, sexual health and healthy ways for folks to express their sexuality, and also then less of what we don't want, a reduction of sexual violence. So we're interested in hearing from you all about what you've heard from college students. So Brenda says, if I say no, he might hear yes anyway, so might as well not say no. And I think, Kristen, you kind of touched on that. Like, if this is going to happen anyways, what's the point? Wanting to want sex isn't the same as wanting sex. So think about interpersonal violence and students in relationships here. So that would have a whole other layer to ambivalence towards sex, for sure. Christina says, we get many students calling our hotline saying things such as, I was drinking, they invited me for Netflix and chill. So again, like, what are these cultural messages? Jeanette saying, not being sure you're sexually attracted to a person, so just really not necessarily knowing one way or another. And there's an obvious tension and contradiction between the casualness of hookup culture and the desire for more genuine connection. So, I mean, it sounds like there's a lot of different ways, a lot of ideas of why students may feel ambivalent towards sex that folks have been hearing and seeing on their campuses.
Yeah, it sounds like there's just a lot of different variations of this, but I think a lot of it sounds like there might be some beginnings in our cultural baggage around our ideas about sexuality. And that sort of feeds into this theme that I wanted to demonstrate with the interview data. As I already mentioned earlier, women might feel ambivalent about sex because of potential outcomes or social repercussions of the sex. And that was echoed in some of my interview data, which sort of speaks to this idea that men disvalue women who have sex, and therefore, women are concerned about that, and therefore they might want sex but then feel concerned about the outcomes of it. And you can see from a couple of different quotes I pulled, for example, Damien says that he's talking about afterwards, after college, you want a wife and not a woman who's done all these people. It's like when you get a new car, you don't want a lot of mileage on it. So again, disvaluing women who've had sex while they're in college. And Joe says that women who haven't had sex are just nicer and they know what they want in life. Richard is quite explicit. He says that it's socially acceptable for guys to have many partners, but not for women. And then, Eric is talking about continuing to pursue sex post-refusal, saying that guys are going to try, and a woman has to refuse because she has to act as though she has standards. So this idea that, women are judged based on their engagement in sex, it's no surprise that they might feel ambivalent about sex. So, feeling ambivalent, certainly as we were talking about, influences consent, but sometimes people, and ambivalence again is feeling torn. Sometimes people might feel, uncertain, and so feeling uncertain can also influence sex. I think that whenever we begin a discussion about consent, it's sort of predicated on this assumption that individuals know in advance if they will or what they'd be willing to do during a sexual encounter. But there's evidence that individuals are often uncertain about what they would do in a sexual encounter. Some really interesting research from Melanie Beers, who is located in, I believe, New Zealand. She and her team asked students to imagine themselves in a dating situation in which one partner initially refuses, but sex eventually happens. And she asked her participants to write about what they think happened between those 2 points. So in this research, Beers and her co-authors had anticipated that students would write about miscommunication. She was speaking about the miscommunication theory. But what she actually found instead was that most of the students wrote about feeling uncertain. And I'm going to quote her article for a second here. She says, the women felt some desire for a sexual relationship with the man, but there were also uncertainties or other feelings that prevented her from agreeing to the original physical demands or verbal requests. So, what we assume is that people know exactly what they want, but in actuality, people might feel ambivalent. And, again, individuals could be uncertain about their sexual intentions for a variety of reasons. Again, they could be ambivalent or uncertain because their decisions to have sex might be contingent on something else. And Melanie Beers and her team found this to be the case, that sometimes your decision making is contingent on other factors, maybe like getting to know someone better and liking what you learn about that, getting aroused, thinking about potential relationships and so forth. And sometimes individuals begin sexual activity tentatively, and they don't really know what they want, and might evaluate their reaction and decide what they want as the sexual encounter unfolds. So, you might approach sex not even knowing what you want to do, and so in these cases, decision-making can be ongoing and a contingent process rather than a discrete event. And Melanie Beers, as well as another researcher named Terry Humphreys, talk a lot about conceptualization of consent as a process or a discrete event. And again, this raises a really interesting issue around consent. I've got some data which supports that as well, in which college students college students not only think about consent as a process, but they think about consent as a process that begins in a socialized environment, like at the bar. So they reported it, particularly the men reported interpreting that if a woman leaves the bar with them, they're indicating their consent. So this process, begins long before the proverbial bedroom. So that also, I think, adds complication, because you might have someone who leaves the bar with another person, not really sure what they want to do, maybe expecting that or wanting some type of sexual activity, maybe kissing or manual sex, but not really sure if they want to engage in intercourse, and that decision might be made as they progress through the evening. And so this idea that we go home with someone as an automatic indicator of consent is really a problematic depiction. And another, so I'm talking about people who feel uncertain. Another, I think, important component is the perception that women in particular are uncertain. So whether or not people actually are uncertain, in some of my interview data, we found that some of the men perceived that women were uncertain, and that the men could convince them. And my doctoral student and I sort of read this convince as potential coercion, although we weren't sure. Even though I conducted all the interviews, it didn't become evident to me until we sat down and read the transcripts that all of the men talked about this idea that they could convince a woman. So, for example, you can see from Eric here, he said he's had experiences where he's had to convince the woman to change her mind. And Damien, says that if she doesn't seem sure when she says no, she can be convinced. But if she's, confident in her refusal, then he knows that's a legitimate refusal. Similarly, Richard says if her refusal is soft, it's not clear, so he can try again. And if it's still soft, he believes he has some option to try to convince her. And then, this sounds, these things sound like they could be bordering on potentially coercion, and I don't really know, and unfortunately I didn't ask what they really meant by this convincing. Did it mean, asking again, or did it mean other type of coercive tactics? And then, finally, Mike, I think, really extends beyond a tentative, is this coercion or not, and he really, I think, implies coercion in his statement. He says it's on a woman to give clear signals, and if the guy knows and still pursues, it's like a sport for him. he talked about like trying to continue to pursue women post-refusal really became somewhat of a game. And in this case, I think this is a coercive, statement about coercion. And in this last comment, he says, so clear signals are meant to be, but don't be so blunt that it's awkward. So he's telling, his statement is women need to be clear, but don't be too clear. And that, I think, creates a tightrope for women to walk down. So, I've talked about several different sociocultural factors that contribute to complications and complexities around consent. I hope that I presented evidence suggesting that this is really complicated, and probably many of you knew that already. So, what do we make of all this? And I think that, what I think we see across this research that I was, talking about are themes related to gender and how aspects of gender norms influence consent. As we already spoke about really early on with the sex ed and gender stereotypes, men and women enter college with different sexual agendas. Then they're put into the party culture, and gender dynamics exist partially because of these predetermined gender stereotypes, which were already existing, but then are reinforced in this party culture that is at a lot of campuses with active Greek life. These party environments are occurring in male-controlled spaces. And we spoke about why this is problematic, but I wanted to highlight that in this dynamic, women are supposed to be nice and accepting of men as hosting, and I demonstrated that through some of the interview data before, that can result in women feeling pressured to have sex. So what I want to emphasize here as I'm sort of wrapping up is that there's a myriad of ways that these gender norms and imbalances influence consent. If you think back to the consent research that I presented really early on, talking about the miscommunication theory, and then the research that refutes the miscommunication theory, I said that that there's research to suggest that men can and do accurately interpret women's nonverbal implicit cues. But you saw in some of my findings, as well as echoed and supported by other people's findings, that men are preferring to wait for this obvious gesture. You heard from Mike on that previous slide saying, look, like she needs to be obvious. Not too obvious that it's blunt, but she needs to be obvious. So, men are potentially looking for this obvious gesture as a mechanism to say, okay, like that's when I need to stop. But if she doesn't say no, as you saw from the other participants, hey, I've got options to try to convince women. Then alternatively, you have women who are concerned about not hurting men's feelings, as I talked about earlier, and potentially even seeing non-consensual sex as a form of relationship maintenance. So, I think in some of my work, so then to like recap or not to recap, but to add another element of dynamic to this, in some of my other work with, again, Dr. Zoe Peterson, we asked men in this study, we asked men and women how they, indicated consent, but we found that men, a small percentage, about 11 to 12% of men reported not giving women the opportunity to say no, or not giving women the option to say no. So in these responses, these men indicated that they don't communicate consent. Instead, they just start having sex because they figured it'd be better to ask for forgiveness rather than ask for permission. So in some instances, that might be okay. If a woman was consenting and there was no communication, well, that might be okay. But if she wasn't consenting, that's a problem. If you're not giving anyone an opportunity to refuse. And what Dr. Peterson and I talked about was this idea that if the men were saying that they didn't want to ask for permission because they wanted to ask for forgiveness later, there might be in some way an assumption that they thought women might say no. So, when we think about all this research and all these different sociocultural factors and these gender dynamics, where does it leave affirmative consent, which was the question we began this webinar with? So I think affirmative consent, and I read that definition earlier on, is about this explicit communication of agreement, and that lack of a refusal shouldn't count or doesn't count as consent. But in addition to saying that consent needs to be explicit, affirmative consent policies also promote a sex-positive perspective on sexuality and consent. And we can see this through a lot of discourse and signage around consent is sexy and promotions of consensual sex is sexy and so forth. And this, these campaigns are built on this idea that if consent is sexy, then non-consent is not sexy, right? And I think that's kind of a neat campaign. And so in theory, we could reduce the occurrence of sexual assault by having this promotion of not just reducing a miscommunication, but promoting this idea that consensual sex is also good sex. In fact, I actually have a study that links consent and quality of sex. So in this sex-positive environment, affirmative consent would be a great policy. Unfortunately, however, that's not the current cultural climate at many universities in the United States. The consent is sexy depiction can't really exist in a cultural climate in which we see things like no means yes and yes means anal. Or where we see things, we see T-shirts that make jokes about consent and rape. Or, where it's sort of the social or cultural expectation that college boys are supposed to rape. This image comes from, in 2012, the University of Miami in Ohio. There were just these signs that looked just like this. I mean, this is a picture of one of them that appeared on the men's dormitory bathrooms. I know you can't read all of it, but the last bullet point, which you might be able to read, says rape, 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 it's college boys, live it up. So, if you think about that, if we have cultural norms like these that suggest that it's the expectation that boys will rape, it's not really, I think, terribly surprising then that football teams cover up sexual assault like we saw recently at Baylor, or that a man who's having sex with a passed-out woman behind a dumpster is then defended because that sex he alleges is consensual, and there's, sort of controversy around that. So, if we see some of these dynamics existing in our current cultural context, affirmative consent as a mechanism to reduce sexual assault won't work. It will be ineffective if it's implemented in isolation. So instead, what I argue, or what I'm advocating for, is an approach to sexuality that's affirmative and that's sex positive. And I think that that's really a necessary approach in order for affirmative consent policies to be an effective mechanism to reduce sexual assault. As I demonstrated, or I hope I demonstrated, consent communication remains largely embedded in a lot of these complicated cultural norms and gender norms, which lead to some, inequities and imbalances around consent. And this policy could be a good place to start, but it's going to be doomed if we implement it in isolation. So we need to be thinking about sociocultural shifts around gender and sexuality, and that be reinforced through student initiatives, through administrative-led initiatives that exists at multiple levels. I think that many of us would agree with the statement that sexual violence is a complex and multidimensional problem. Therefore, the solution needs to be multi-pronged as well, including these policy changes, that exist at affirmative consent level and around Title IX. But affirmative consent, implementing these policies, particularly affirmative consent, can't be just lip service. So if we implement a policy that says, lack of refusal or lack of or silence is not consent, we need to follow through on implementing that. And so that needs to occur at the policy level, but then we also need to have programming to combat some of these unfortunate cultural messages that students get leading into college. So things, at the community level and the organization level, as well as individual and interpersonal level. Some of the programs I think from reading the comments, the Green Dot program and other programs that people say they're a part of, the bystander type interventions, these are all really good multi-pronged approaches that occur, at multiple levels. And so, again, I think that that there is a lot of complication to issues around consent. Affirmative consent can be part of this dialogue. And as Ashley began the talk, or began some of our earlier discussions, that college students arrive at campus and we're expected to fix all of these things. Well, it was very complicated to lead us up to where they are at in college, so the solution, again, needs to be multi-pronged and multi-tiered using an ecological perspective. And there's unfortunately not a simple answer. In that vein, I know we only have a couple minutes left, but I'd love to hear some other people's ideas for including consent in sexual violence and prevention work on their campuses, as I know we have a ton of people who are experts and already doing some of this work.
Thank you, Kristen. And there's been, while we let people respond to that question and close up, and I wish we could continue talking about this because there's still so much. But one of the conversations that's been happening throughout the conversation in the text chat was really about, a lot of this research really looks at, it's focused on heteronormative and cisgender instances. And so where does that leave trans students? And where does that leave same-sex sexual relationships? And so is there research that you can maybe point to that includes those experiences? Because, there's some very unique experiences when we're talking about trans students or same-sex sexual instances in terms of consent.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I should have prefaced this talk with the fact that this is a very heteronormative biased talk, in that I was speaking very exclusively, the research that I presented was exclusively about heterosexual college students. Part of the reason that my talk was very heteronormative is because a lot of the research is about heterosexual college students. There is one study from 2003 from, I already mentioned her name, Melanie Beers, where she looked at same-sex couples who are in same-sex relationships and consent, and she found that they were consenting to sex using similar cues to heterosexual college students. However, she's even critical of her own work, and I, I'm a little bit critical in that she basically took what had already been found for college students, and then asked if that was the same for for same-sex couples. And so, I think that there's certainly more research that is warranted. I can say that one of my other doctoral students and I got funding recently to look at sexual violence within same-sex sexual relationships, because unfortunately, I'd say it is very gendered, a lot of these issues, and so it probably would look different within same-sex, or even within transgender, outside of cisgendered individuals, and outside of that gender binary. Unfortunately, the research, I think, is a bit lacking, but there are some good resources, hopefully forthcoming, and people who I can say are really invested in this.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And I mean, as we started today's conversation, this really is just the beginning. This topic is so big, and there are so many conversations that we need to be having. And Sierra brought up another one, that we didn't talk about hetero relationships when men are assaulted, and what those consent messages are there. And so absolutely. But again, this is just the beginning. So if we need to do 5 more web conferences just on consent, that's something that, we'll do. But thank you so much, Kristen. I know you've put your contact information up, so if folks want to follow up. And also these references are all available on our website. This was recorded, and you will get a link to that. We hope you'll join us for our next Prevent Connect Campus Web Conference. Thank you all so much for joining us. For all of the information that you shared and all of the resources, we will be sending out the text chat, so you'll be able to capture those resources. And Kristen, thank you so much for your everything that you shared with us today, all of your research and all of your insight into this topic, because it is such an important one that we need to be having conversations about. So thank you.
Absolutely, and thank you, Ashley, and thanks for putting this on, and thanks everyone who attended. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you all. This ends our web conference for today. Thank you. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.